A massive cash deposit suddenly surfaced in Annie Guthrie's financial records, with no clear explanation and no matching transaction to account for it. There was nothing showing where it came from, just a figure far larger than anything else surrounding the account activity. It sat in the records like a boulder thrown into calm water, and federal forensic accountants reviewing months of financial data reportedly paused the moment they found it, not because large deposits are automatically suspicious, but because this one left no paper trail, no wire transfer origin, and no documented source. There was no corresponding transaction anywhere in the records investigators examined that could explain where that money originated, and why it landed in Annie Guthrie's account at that exact moment. In financial forensics, unexplained money is never neutral. It either came from a legitimate source that hasn't been documented yet, or it came from a source someone deliberately kept off the books. There are no other possibilities. And investigators are reportedly working relentlessly to determine which explanation fits, because the timing of this deposit when it appeared and what was happening around it, and how it connects to everything else, investigators have uncovered, in this case may be even more important than the amount itself. Let's examine the forensic significance of an unexplained cash deposit inside a federal murder investigation, because the implications go far beyond a simple financial mystery. Money entering the banking system without a traceable source is a problem in any investigation, but it becomes a very specific kind of problem in a case where the financial landscape has already been painstakingly reconstructed. The forensic accountants assigned to this case didn't approach Annie Guthrie's records blind. They arrived after months of investigation with a detailed understanding of her income, expenses, debts, account structures, and normal spending habits. They knew exactly what her financial life typically looked like and had established a baseline that made unusual activities stand out instantly. And a large cash deposit with no supporting documentation is about as dramatic a deviation as financial forensics can uncover. The immediate question it raises looks backward. Where did this money come from? What transaction, arrangement, or relationship generated this exact amount at this exact time? And why is there no documentation anywhere in the surrounding records explaining its source? Those questions rarely stay innocent in the middle of an active federal homicide investigation. If the money came from a legitimate source, such as a property sale, inheritance, legal settlement, or documented loan, records of that source should exist somewhere. Finding them would end the mystery immediately. The fact that investigators reportedly haven't closed that lead suggests the legitimate paperwork is either missing, or it may not exist at all. Here's why the timing of the deposit matters so much, because investigators reportedly view the when as being just as important as the amount. The deposit didn't appear during some random chapter of Annie Guthrie's financial history. It reportedly surfaced during a period investigators already consider critical. That window overlaps with other key events on the master investigative timeline, which forensic accountants have been comparing against financial data throughout this investigation. Financial analysis has already indicated that Annie's records showed signs of mounting pressure before Nancy's disappearance, declining balances, growing credit obligations, and spending patterns that didn't align with her documented income, painting the picture of someone under severe financial strain. A large cash deposit appearing in that environment, right in the middle of documented financial distress, is a very specific kind of event. It represents a sudden influx into a financial situation that had been steadily deteriorating, and sudden influxes in a financial record under forensic scrutiny demand answers, not only because of where the money came from, but because of what it was intended for. Was the deposit a payment, compensation, or something else? Was it money provided by someone to cover expenses, manage a problem, or reward a particular action? In a case where investigators believe specific, deliberate actions occurred along a defined timeline, a large, unexplained payment appearing within that same timeline is not something investigators are dismissing as a coincidence. The source tracing process is where financial forensics becomes highly technical, and understanding that process explains why investigators haven't resolved this lead even after identifying the deposit. Cash deposits are among the hardest financial transactions to trace because they leave the banking system at the point of withdrawal and re-enter it only when deposited elsewhere, without any automatic electronic trail linking the two events. A wire transfer contains routing numbers and banking identifiers, connecting sender and recipient. A check contains account information tied to a specific holder. A digital payment carries transaction IDs linked to platform records. Cash works differently. It leaves one account as a withdrawal, moves as physical currency, and enters another account as a deposit. The banking system records the exit and the arrival, but it does not automatically connect the two. To trace cash, investigators must locate the withdrawal that generated it, which means examining every account that could realistically have produced a withdrawal of that size around the same time the deposit appeared. That process is reportedly already underway. Forensic accountants are said to be reviewing wire transfer records, property transaction documents, financial correspondence, and every other record that could reveal the deposit's origin. They're working both forward and backward through time, searching for the withdrawal that came before the deposit and any financial documentation explaining why money moved from its original source into Annie Guthrie's account. Whether they've identified the source yet and what that source maybe remains unresolved, but the direction of the investigation and the intense focus being placed on this single transaction suggest the source isn't obvious, which means the explanation may be far from innocent. This is where the property transaction theory becomes especially important, because it remains one of the most plausible legitimate explanations for a large cash deposit, and one investigators reportedly have not been able to verify. Property has been deeply woven into this case from the very beginning. The signed document outlining property interests connected to Nancy. The estate arrangements, investigators believe, were designed to benefit certain individuals after Nancy's death, and the beneficiary designations. Nancy was reportedly trying to change them, along with the unusual property-related conversations she was having in her final days. Property transactions can generate substantial sums of money. Sales, partial transfers, and equity withdrawals can all produce amounts consistent with what investigators reportedly discovered in the deposit. If the deposit came from a property transaction, there should be documentation, a closing statement, a title transfer record, a deed filed with the county, or a real estate attorney's file. Yet investigators examining property-related transactions as a possible source reportedly are not finding that documentation, or they're finding records that raise even more questions than answers. Either the property transaction that generated this money wasn't documented through normal channels, or it wasn't a property sale at all, and the property explanation is simply a story built around a payment, whose true source lies elsewhere. In a case where a signed property document was discovered inside Annie's home and financial strain was clearly documented in her records, the overlap between property interests and unexplained cash is not something investigators can ignore. It's the most direct possible link between the case's financial motive structure and a mysterious financial event in Annie's account. Now let's examine the connection between this deposit and the financial pressure narrative investigators have already established, because that connection is both direct and critical. Forensic accountants identified Annie Guthrie as someone living under sustained financial stress in the months leading up to Nancy's disappearance. The pressure was well documented: shrinking balances, heavy credit use, and spending patterns that didn't match her income. It was the profile of someone on an unsustainable financial path. Financial pressure, combined with a large unexplained cash deposit, creates a very specific forensic narrative. The pressure creates the need, while the deposit potentially represents the answer to that need. The gap between them, the period separating the documented financial strain and the arrival of the unexplained funds, is reportedly the window investigators are scrutinizing most intensely. If that gap closes around the critical timeline of this case, if the deposit appeared at a moment that aligns with something investigators believe took place, then it no longer describes just a financial transaction, it describes a payment, compensation for something that happened. Money provided to someone who did something, facilitated something, or allowed something to happen. That conclusion has not been proven, but it is reportedly the theory investigators are testing against the evidence. And so far, the financial forensics in this case has repeatedly produced findings that support the broader investigative picture rather than challenge it. The financial pressure was real, the signed document was real, the beneficiary structure was real, the insurance policy was real, and a large unexplained deposit appearing in the middle of that financial landscape, at a time investigators consider crucial, is being treated as real as well. The question is, real evidence of what? Here's the larger financial picture this deposit fits into, because context is everything in financial forensics. Investigators have already identified several independent financial threads: Annie's documented financial strain, the money transfers within the family, the unusual withdrawal activity previously flagged by forensic accountants, and transaction timestamps that overlap with key moments in the case. Each thread was significant on its own. Together, they reveal a financial life that was complicated, pressured, and constantly shifting during a period of critical events. The large cash deposit doesn't replace any of those threads, it potentially ties them together. If the deposit came from an intra-family transfer, money moving from within the family circle into Annie's account without transparent documentation, it potentially links the family finance thread with the unexplained funds thread. Two important threads become one even more significant thread when they're connected by a single transaction. But if the deposit came from outside the family, from a relative's associate with a criminal record, from a third party tied to the broader network, or from a source with no obvious, legitimate connection to Annie Guthrie, it opens an entirely different investigative path, one that could identify additional individuals with financial ties to this case who were never part of the investigation's formal scope. Financial forensics has a way of expanding investigations simply by following money back to its source. Whatever the source of this deposit ultimately turns out to be, It will either deepen the existing picture or introduce entirely new people and relationships into it. Another critical aspect of this development is how previously reviewed records have suddenly taken on new significance. Reflecting how financial is meant, forensics works as a cumulative process rather than a one-time review. Investigators who identified this deposit didn't discover it during their first pass through Annie's financial records. It reportedly emerged during a later review, a re-examination of records that once appeared routine but are now being viewed through the lens of everything the investigation has uncovered since the original review. That's how mature investigations handle financial evidence. The first review establishes the baseline. Later reviews search for anomalies that weren't obvious during the initial pass, because the investigative context wasn't yet developed enough to reveal their importance. A transaction that looked ordinary in week 2 of the investigation can appear entirely different by month 6, once the full picture of what was happening during that period has been forensically reconstructed. The deposit reportedly became significant in hindsight. It had always been in the records, but the context needed to understand its importance. The documented financial pressure, the signed document, the insurance policy, the beneficiary changes, and the physical evidence recovered from the property wasn't fully assembled until recently. Once it was, investigators reportedly returned to the financial records and found something they could no longer ignore. That retrospective significance is completely legitimate in forensic analysis. Evidence doesn't have to be recognized immediately to matter. It must be accurately documented, preserved, and ultimately understood within the larger context surrounding it. And that surrounding context is reportedly what made this deposit stand out as something worthy of deeper scrutiny. Now, let's address the most troubling possibility of what this deposit could represent, because investigators can't ignore it, and neither can we. In cases where someone is paid to commit a crime, facilitate one, or stay silent about one, that money has to go somewhere. At some point, it has to enter the financial system, and when it does, it creates exactly the kind of transaction investigators are reportedly examining here. An unexplained deposit far larger than the surrounding account activity, appearing at a time that aligns with events investigators believe took place. If this deposit was a payment not from a property transaction, not from a family transfer, and not from any legitimate documented source, then its origin points to someone who had a reason to compensate Annie Guthrie for something. Someone who benefited from something she did, facilitated, or permitted. Someone whose own financial records would reveal a matching withdrawal, the same amount, leaving one account and arriving in another. That corresponding withdrawal is reportedly what investigators are searching for, because finding it closes the loop. It identifies the payer and establishes the financial connection between that person and Annie Guthrie within the critical timeline of the case, providing the most direct possible link. Documentary evidence of a financial arrangement tied directly to the events investigators believe took place. In a case where the physical evidence points to deliberate, premeditated action, and where financial records have already revealed a motive structure built around profiting from Nancy's death, an unexplained payment to Annie Guthrie would be the financial equivalent of a confession, not in a legal sense, but in an investigative one. A transaction that only makes sense in one context, appearing at one specific moment, and linking one specific group of people. Investigators are reportedly working toward identifying exactly that connection. Whether they've succeeded yet remains unknown, but the extraordinary attention focused on this deposit suggests they believe a matching withdrawal exists somewhere in the financial system, waiting to be uncovered. Let's talk about how forensic accountants trace unexplained cash, because the methodology itself matters. The first step is defining the deposit with precision. The exact amount, the exact date and time, the branch or ATM where it was made, and whether it arrived in a single transaction or was broken into multiple deposits. Structuring the practice of making deposits just below reporting thresholds to avoid automatic bank reporting is itself a federal crime and an immediate red flag for investigators. The second step is building a withdrawal inventory. Every account that could realistically have generated a cash withdrawal of that size during the relevant period is examined. Family members' accounts, the accounts of known associates, and the accounts of anyone already identified within the financial network investigators have mapped. They're searching for a withdrawal that matches the deposit in amount, timing, and location. The third step is analyzing the geographic component. If the deposit was made at a specific bank branch, that branch may have surveillance footage covering teller stations and ATMs. If the deposit was made in person, investigators may be able to identify who made it. If it was made through an ATM, transaction records and potentially camera footage can help establish exactly who deposited the funds. All three of these steps are reportedly active in the investigation's review of this deposit. The combination of financial record analysis, withdrawal inventory comparisons, and geographic surveillance evidence creates a powerful multi-pronged strategy that is extremely difficult to evade. Cash may be anonymous while it's moving as physical currency, but the moment it enters the banking system, it becomes traceable. Here's the aspect of this discovery that ties it to the broader timeline in the most direct way possible. The investigation has established, through communication forensics, that Annie made her first post-incident call to a family associate with a criminal record, a person investigators believe may hold critical information about the events surrounding Nancy's disappearance. If the deposit that appeared in Annie's account has a matching withdrawal from that associate's account, or from any account connected to him, then financial forensics may have answered one of the investigation's most persistent questions. What was the true nature of the relationship between Annie and this individual, and what exactly was being exchanged between them? What began as a question about communication patterns suddenly becomes a question with a direct financial answer. Money moving between the person Annie called first after the incident and Annie herself, in an amount that cannot be explained by any legitimate purpose, at a time that aligns with events investigators believe occurred that is a forensic connection carrying prosecutorial implications that extend far beyond the financial trail. It potentially links the recipient of that first call not only to Annie's communications, but also to the financial arrangements surrounding what investigators believe happened to Nancy. It places him inside the financial picture at its most critical moment, and gives investigators documentary evidence of their relationship that no amount of communication record analysis alone could fully establish. The border crossing record that surfaced in the previous investigative development adds yet another layer to the significance of this deposit, and the connection deserves a closer look. Creating a fraudulent federal border crossing record, if that's what the Mexico entry actually represents, requires specialized capabilities that most people don't possess, and most services don't provide for free. Document fraud, identity creation, and potentially corrupt contacts at border facilities. These are services that exist within specific criminal networks, and they often come with a substantial financial cost. A large, unexplained cash deposit in Annie Guthrie's account, appearing during the period investigators are examining, could represent money received, or it could represent funds that were later moved elsewhere to pay for services, compensate individuals with specialized skills, or finance the operational side of a concealment strategy whose sophistication has remained a recurring feature of this case. If forensic accountants can trace what happened to the money after it entered Annie's account, where it went next, through which channels, and to which recipients, the deposit becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a map, a financial blueprint of the concealment network, a trail of money moving from someone who benefited from Nancy's death, through Annie's account and onward to the people and services allegedly involved in shaping the investigation's direction. That map, if fully reconstructed, could become the most comprehensive evidence of coordinated concealment. This investigation has uncovered not just one person, one place, or one act, but an entire financial network documented through transaction records, revealing the full operational scope of what was done, and who was paid to do it. Here's where this deposit fits within the complete financial picture investigators have now assembled. Stated plainly and in full, the investigation established Annie's financial distress as a baseline, documented declining balances, growing credit obligations, and spending inconsistent with income, a person who needed money and needed it continuously. The investigation uncovered a signed document in Annie's home describing property interests connected to Nancy, a legal instrument potentially worth substantial value upon Nancy's death, financial need, paired with a legal mechanism that required one specific event to activate. The investigation also found an insurance policy of significant value, reportedly known to Annie, whose payout would likewise be triggered by Nancy's death. The investigation documented the beneficiary changes Nancy was reportedly attempting to make, apparently because she had discovered that the financial structure surrounding her death had been arranged to benefit specific individuals, including Annie. And now, investigators have identified a large unexplained cash deposit in Annie's account, appearing during a period they consider critical, with no documented legitimate source. The financial picture is no longer merely circumstantial, it has become a sequential narrative. Financial pressure created the need. Property and insurance arrangements created the camming mechanism. Nancy's apparent discovery of those arrangements may have accelerated the timeline, and the unexplained deposit represents money that moved within the context of everything we've discussed. Money whose origin, once identified, will reportedly close the final major gap in the financial forensics of this case. One final observation about what this deposit means for the investigation's legal position, because it matters when it comes to understanding where this case may be headed. Financial evidence is among the most powerful forms of evidence presented at trial for one key reason: it's objective. It has no credibility issues, no bias, and no faulty memory. It's a permanent record of what happened, preserved in institutional databases maintained by entities with absolutely no stake in the outcome of any specific criminal case. A jury looking at a large unexplained cash deposit in a murder suspect's account, appearing during the critical window of an investigation and coming from an undocumented source, is going to have questions. And a prosecution team presenting those questions, within the framework of a complete financial picture, the pressure, the mechanism, the victim's efforts to dismantle it, and now the unexplained payment, is presenting a motive narrative that is both concrete and easy to understand. Prosecutors value financial evidence because it turns an abstract motive into something tangible. They can show a jury numbers, dates, transaction records, and account balances, the story of someone who needed money and apparently did something to obtain it, not as speculation, but as documentation. The unexplained deposit is reportedly the final piece of that documentation, the transaction that completes the financial motive narrative by showing not only that money was at stake, but that money actually moved in connection with the events investigators believe took place. And when they determine where it came from, and financial forensics eventually does determine where it came from, the question of why Nancy Guthrie disappeared may ultimately be answered in numbers. The most shocking discovery wasn't the money itself, but the possibility that a single, unexplained deposit, sitting in the financial records for months without being fully understood, may have contained the key to a motive structure investigators had been assembling from every other direction at the very same time. The source is reportedly being traced right now, and in financial forensics, unexplained transactions never remain unexplained forever. The answer is somewhere in the records, and investigators are going to find it.